The stars had never looked so cold to Admiral Sithara as they did on that terrible morning, and she stood on the bridge of the ascending light, watching the wreckage of her fleet drift past the viewport like the bones of dead giants floating in an endless sea of black. 33 ships had entered this system under her command, and now 43 ships hung broken and silent in the orbit of a moon that had no name. A moon as dead as her hopes of ever seeing home again. The Cathari swarm had come without warning, and they had come with fury that the Valorians had not expected, tearing through the fleet like fire through dry grass before vanishing back into the darkness between. Star's chief engineer Velthos stood beside her, his pale blue skin looking almost gray in the dim emergency lighting, and his 4 eyes blinked in sequence as he reviewed the damage reports on his crystalline datapad. "Admiral," he said in a voice heavy with the weight of 3,000 years of engineering tradition, "I must inform you that the fleet is beyond recovery." Sithara did not turn from the viewport, and she watched another piece of hull plating spin slowly past, catching the light of the distant sun before tumbling away into shadow. "Explain," she commanded. "The crystalline matrix engines on every vessel have suffered catastrophic fracturing," Velthos continued, and his long fingers traced the damage assessments with something like grief. "The quantum cores are destabilized beyond safe parameters, and the living lattice structures that power our drives cannot be repaired once broken." "Cannot?" Sithara asked, and finally she turned to face him. "Cannot," Velthos confirmed with absolute certainty. "Our technology is grown, Admiral, not built. And you cannot ungrow what has been shattered any more than you can unbreak an egg, or unspill water from a cup." Sithara closed her eyes and let the weight of command settle heavy on her shoulders, because she understood what Velthos was telling her. Even if he would not say the words directly, the fleet would have to be scuttled, and her people would have to wait in this dead system for rescue that might take weeks to arrive. Assuming the Cathari did not return first to finish what they had started, how long until the Concordat can send help? She asked. 14 cycles at minimum, Velthos replied. Perhaps longer if the swarm has disrupted communications along the relay network. 14 cycles, Sithara thought. And she felt something cold settle in her chest where hope used to live. It was then that the communication officer spoke up from his station, his voice carrying a note of confusion that seemed out of place amid the despair. "Admiral, we are receiving a transmission from an approaching vessel." "Cathari?" Sithara demanded, and her hand moved instinctively toward the command console, even though she knew her ship had nothing left to fight with. "No." "Admiral," the officer replied, and his confusion deepened. "It appears to be a human cargo freighter." Sithara blinked, and for a moment she could not process what she had heard, because humans were among the youngest species in the galactic community, barely 3 centuries removed from their first fumbling steps into interstellar space. "What are they doing in this sector?" she asked. "Unknown, Admiral, but they are responding to our distress beacon and offering assistance." Velthos made a sound that among his people indicated polite dismissal, and he set down his datapad with the air of someone who had heard a joke that was not particularly funny. "Assistance," he repeated. "What assistance could humans possibly offer us?" Sithara shared his skepticism, because she had met humans before at diplomatic functions and trade negotiations, and while she found them curious and energetic in a way that reminded her of children discovering a new toy, she could not imagine what a species that still used chemical propulsion on some of their smaller vessels could do to help repair crystalline matrix engines that human science would not understand for another 1,000 years. "Respond to them," she ordered anyway, because courtesy cost nothing, and she was not so proud that she would refuse even symbolic gestures of solidarity in her darkest hour. The human vessel appeared on the main view screen moments later, and Sithara felt her skepticism harden into something close to despair. Ship was ugly in ways she had not known ships could be ugly, with mismatched hull plates and visible welding scars, and what appeared to be actual rust around some of the external fittings. And painted on its side in bold letters was a name that her translator rendered as Rusty Nail. A human face appeared on the screen, belonging to a female with short dark hair and a smile that seemed entirely inappropriate for the circumstances. "This is Captain Maria Santos of the independent freighter Rusty Nail," the human said. "We picked up your distress signal and came to see if we could help." "Captain Santos," Sithara replied with formal grace. "I am Admiral Sithara of the Valorian Concordat, and while I appreciate your concern, I must inform you that our situation is beyond the aid that your vessel could provide." "Maybe so," Santos said, and her smile did not waver. "But I have someone on board who would really like to take a look at your ships, if you would allow it." "Take a look?" Vel'Thos interrupted, and his tone carried offense that he did not bother to hide. "These are Valorian warships with technology your species will not develop for centuries, and they are damaged beyond any possibility of repair." "So I heard," Santos replied, and she stepped aside to reveal another human standing behind her. This one was older, with gray hair cut short and a face lined by decades of work and weather, and his hands were stained with something dark that Sithara would later learn was called oil, and his eyes held a light that seemed completely unbothered by words like impossible or beyond repair. "This is Deacon Gray," Santos said. "He is my chief engineer, and he has a talent for fixing things that other people say cannot be fixed." "Deacon." Gray stepped forward and gave a small nod that humans used as a gesture of respect. And when he spoke, his voice was calm and rough like gravel rolling down a hillside. "Admiral," he said, "I understand your ships are broken, and your people say they cannot be repaired." "That is correct," Sithara confirmed. "Well," Deacon Gray said, and something in his expression shifted into what Sithara would eventually recognize as determination. "I have been fixing broken things my whole life, and I have learned that cannot is just a word people use when they have run out of ideas." He paused and looked directly into the view screen, as if he could see through it into her very soul. "Can I take a look?" Yes, Sithara did not know why she said yes. And perhaps it was desperation or curiosity, or simply the strange certainty in this human's eyes. But she found herself giving the order to allow the Rusty Nail to dock with her ship, and that was how Deacon Gray, a 52-year-old human engineer with oil-stained hands and a roll of tape in his pocket, first set foot aboard a Valorian warship and began to do the impossible. The engine room of the Ascending Light was a cathedral of crystal and light, and Deacon Gray stood in the center of it with his hands on his hips and his head tilted back like a man studying the ceiling of a church he had never seen. The four massive crystalline structures rose from the floor to the ceiling, their surfaces covered in patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living things, and soft blue light pulsed through them in rhythms that reminded Deacon of a heartbeat that had grown weak and irregular. Chief Engineer Vel'Thos walked beside him with barely concealed impatience, and his four eyes watched the human with the expression of someone forced to give a tour to a guest who could not possibly understand what they were seeing. "These are the crystalline matrix engines," Vel'Thos explained in a tone that suggested he was speaking to a particularly slow child. "They are grown over centuries from seed crystals using techniques that your species has no framework to comprehend." Deacon nodded and said nothing, and he walked closer to one of the massive crystal pillars and ran his stained fingers along its surface. "Do not touch that," Vel'Thos snapped, and several other Valorian engineers who had gathered to watch gasped in horror. "The lattice is sacred and must be treated with reverence." "Sacred," Deacon repeated, and he did not remove his hand. "What is wrong with it exactly?" Vel'Thos made a sound of frustration and gestured at the damage that was visible even to untrained eyes. Great cracks that ran through the crystal like frozen lightning, and dark spots where the blue light had faded to nothing. "The matrix is fractured," he said. "The living connections between the lattice points have been severed. And without those connections, the engine cannot generate the harmonic resonance needed to fold space. So the pieces are not talking to each other anymore." Deacon said. Velthos paused and considered this crude simplification before nodding reluctantly. "In essence, yes. And you cannot make them talk again?" "Impossible," Velthos declared. "Once the living lattice is broken, it cannot be restored. And we would need to grow an entirely new engine matrix, which takes 300 years minimum." Deacon Gray stepped back from the crystal and looked around the engine room with eyes that seemed to be calculating something that no one else could see. And then he reached into the bag he had carried with him from the rusty nail and began pulling out tools. The Valorian engineers watched in confusion as he produced items that looked primitive beyond description, including a metal device that he called a soldering iron and rolls of gray tape and tubes of something he called JB weld and lengths of wire in various colors. "What are you doing?" Velthos demanded. "Going to fix your engine," Deacon replied simply. The laughter that followed was not kind, and several of the Valorian engineers exchanged looks of disbelief, while others simply stared at the human as if he had announced his intention to fly by flapping his arms. "Human," Velthos said with exaggerated patience, "I have explained to you that this engine cannot be repaired, and your primitive tools could not interact with our technology, even if repair was possible." Deacon ignored him and walked to a section of the crystal where several major cracks intersected. And he knelt down and began examining the damage more closely. "The way I see it," he said as he worked, "you have a bunch of broken pieces that used to be connected, and they need to be connected again." "That is a vast oversimplification," Velthos protested. "Maybe," Deacon agreed. "But simple is how I work." He reached into his bag and pulled out the gray tape. And before anyone could stop him, he had torn off a strip and pressed it firmly over one of the cracks in the crystal. The silence that followed was absolute, and every Valorian in the room stared at the tape with expressions that ranged from horror to fury to complete incomprehension. "You," Velthos whispered, and his voice trembled with outrage. "You put adhesive tape on a crystalline matrix engine." "Duct tape," Deacon corrected. "Best invention humanity ever came up with. This is desecration." One of the younger engineers cried out. "This is an insult to 3,000 years of Valorian engineering tradition." Deacon continued working as if he had not heard, and he applied more tape to more cracks while pulling out wires and beginning to connect sections of crystal that had never been designed to be connected in such ways. "Your engine grew these connections naturally," he said as he worked. "But there is no reason signals cannot travel through other materials if you give them a path. That is not how crystalline matrix engines work." Velthos shouted. "No," Deacon agreed calmly. "It is how I work." He continued for hours while the Valorians watched in stunned silence, and he bypassed broken sections entirely by running wires around them. And he sealed cracks with combinations of tape and adhesive that the engineers found physically painful to observe. And he connected systems that had never been meant to interact in ways that violated every principle of Valorian design. One point he asked for a hammer, and when a confused engineer provided one, he struck the side of a crystal housing firmly 3 times. "What was that?" Velthos demanded in a strangled voice. "Percussive maintenance," Deacon replied. "Sometimes things just need a good knock to get moving again." When he finally stepped back from the engine, the crystalline pillars looked like they had been attacked by a madman with a hardware store, covered in tape and wires and patches of adhesive in a pattern that seemed to follow no logic whatsoever. "This is a disaster," Velthos declared. "You have turned our sacred engines into a mockery." "Maybe," Deacon said, and he walked to a control panel and began entering commands. But let us see if this mockery can fly. He pressed a final button, and for a long moment nothing happened. And the Valorians began to exchange knowing looks that said they had expected nothing different. Then, the crystals began to hum. The sound was wrong, uneven and rough where it should have been smooth. But it was unmistakably the sound of a crystalline matrix engine coming to life. And the blue light that had faded to darkness began to pulse again in patterns that were chaotic but undeniably present. Impossible. Velthos breathed. 40% efficiency, Deacon said, reading the displays that flickered on the control panel. Maybe 45 if we are lucky, and it will not win any beauty contests. But it will move this ship. He turned to face the chief engineer with an expression that held no pride and no mockery. Just the simple satisfaction of a man who had done what he came to do. You built your engines to be perfect, he said. But I do not need perfect, and I just need good enough. Velthos stared at the working engine, at the tape and wires and patches that held it together, and he struggled to find words for what he was witnessing. How? He finally managed. Deacon Gray shrugged and wiped his hands on a rag he pulled from his back pocket. Where I come from, he said. We have a saying that impossible just means you have not gotten desperate enough yet. He looked around the engine room at the horrified and amazed faces of the Valorian engineers. And then he shouldered his bag and headed for the door. Now, he said, let us go see about the other 42 ships. The war room of the Ascending Light had become a classroom, and Admiral Sithara watched from the doorway as Deacon Gray stood before a group of Valorian engineers and explained concepts that seemed to cause them physical pain to hear. Your problem, Deacon was saying, is that you think there is one right way to fix things. He held up a piece of conduit that he had salvaged from one of the damaged ships, and it was bent and scorched and clearly never intended to be used again. You look at this and see garbage, he continued. But I look at this and see a solution waiting to happen. Chief Engineer. Velthos stood at the back of the group with his arms crossed and his expression torn between fascination and offense. And he had not left Deacon's side since watching the human bring the Ascending Light's engines back to life. You cannot use damaged components, one of the younger engineers protested. They are compromised and could fail at any moment. Everything can fail at any moment, Deacon replied. The question is whether it will work long enough to do what you need it to do. He tossed the conduit to the young engineer, who caught it with surprised reflexes. This piece of metal does not need to last forever, Deacon said. It just needs to last until we get somewhere safe. And that is a much easier problem to solve, Admiral. Sithara stepped fully into the room and the engineers parted to let her through, their respect for her rank still intact, even as their understanding of engineering was being rebuilt from the ground up. How many ships can you repair? She asked Deacon directly. Repair is a strong word, Deacon said with a small smile. But I think I can get most of them moving if your people are willing to help and willing to let go of some ideas about how things should be done. The Kethari will return, Sithara said. Our intelligence suggests they are regrouping and will be back in this system within 40 hours. The room went silent at this news, and the engineers who had been skeptical of Deacon's methods suddenly looked at him with something closer to desperate hope. 40 hours, Deacon repeated, and he rubbed his chin with one oil-stained hand. That is not much time, but it is more than none. He turned to address the entire room with a new urgency in his voice. I am going to teach you some things that will make you uncomfortable, he said. And I need you to trust me even when what I am telling you goes against everything you have ever learned. Velthos stepped forward with his 4 eyes narrowed in concentration. What do you need us to do? First, Deacon said, I need you to forget about fixing things the right way. Because we do not have time for the right way, and the right way is not coming to save us. He began pacing as he spoke, his boots echoing on the deck plates of the war room. Second, I need you to understand something that humans learn early and never forget, which is that a broken thing that works is better than a perfect thing that does not exist. He stopped and looked at each engineer in turn. Where I come from, we call this the doctrine of good enough. And it means that you do what you can with what you have, and you stop worrying about what you wish you had. For the next several hours, Deacon Gray taught the Valorian engineers concepts that had no translation in their language because they had never needed such words before. He taught them about redundancy, which meant building in multiple backup systems, even if those systems were crude, because when one thing failed, you wanted 3 other things ready to take its place. He taught them about field expedient repairs, which meant using whatever materials were at hand, regardless of whether those materials were designed for the purpose you were putting them to. He taught them about the human tradition of percussive maintenance, and he demonstrated how sometimes a firm strike to the right location could jar loose connections back into place in ways that delicate adjustments could not. And he taught them the most important lesson of all, which was that if something was stupid, but it worked, then it was not stupid. Valorians divided into teams and spread across the fleet, and Deacon moved between ships like a general commanding troops on a battlefield, offering guidance and encouragement, and occasionally taking over when a repair proved too unusual for even his new students to attempt. They pulled hull plating from ships too damaged to save and welded it onto ships that could still fly, creating patchwork vessels that looked like they had been assembled by children with access to too many spare parts. They rerouted power through systems that were never designed to carry it, running energy through navigation arrays to boost weapons and through life support to reinforce shields. They connected ships together with cables and conduits salvaged from wreckage, creating networks that allowed working systems on one vessel to support failing systems on another. And everywhere they went, they left behind the marks of human engineering, tape and wire and improvised patches that the Valorians had begun to call gray marks in honor of the human who had shown them a new way to think. Admiral Cythera visited the engine room of a cruiser that had been declared unsalvageable just 12 hours earlier and found it humming with power, its crystalline matrices wrapped in so much tape that they barely glowed through the gray coating. "It looks terrible," she observed. "Yes," Deacon agreed, wiping sweat from his forehead with his ever-present rag, "but it will fly and it will fight. And when this is over, you can build all the pretty new engines you want. The Cathari expect to find us helpless," Cythera said. And something new had entered her voice, something that sounded almost like hope. "The Cathari are going to find something they have never seen before," Deacon replied. "A fleet held together by willpower and tape, and the absolute refusal to accept that the job cannot be done." As the deadline approached and the Valorians worked with desperate energy to bring every possible ship back to fighting condition, Cythera found Deacon standing alone on an observation deck, looking out at the fleet he had helped resurrect. 43 ships drifted in formation, scarred and patched and covered in modifications that violated every principle of Valorian design. But they were active and armed, and their crews were ready. "Thank you," Cythera said simply. Deacon shook his head. "Do not thank me yet," he said. "The hard part is still coming. And having ships that can fight is not the same as winning the fight. You have given us a chance," Cythera replied. "And that is more than we had before." Deacon turned to look at her with those calm gray eyes that had seen so many broken things made whole. "There is something else I should tell you," he said, "about how humans fight when we are desperate, and as the Cathari swarm began to appear on long-range sensors, Deacon Gray explained to Admiral Cythera that the same philosophy that let humans fix the unfixable also let them do other impossible things, like win battles that should not be won. The Cathari swarm emerged from fold space like a plague of locusts descending on a field of grain. their sleek black vessels filling the sensors with hostile signatures that numbered in the hundreds on the bridge of the ascending light. Admiral Sithara stood beside Deacon Gray and watched the enemy fleet take formation. Their movements precise and coordinated in ways that spoke of hive intelligence and perfect discipline. "They outnumber us 5-1, Velthos reported from his station, his voice carrying the weight of what seemed like inevitable defeat. "Numbers are not everything," Deacon said quietly. The Cathari commander broadcast a message that the ship's translation systems rendered into words that dripped with contempt and certainty. "Valorians," the alien voice hissed, "your fleet was destroyed, and we have returned to collect your bodies and your technology. So surrender now, and your deaths will be swift." Sithara looked at Deacon, and the human nodded once with an expression that suggested he was about to play a game he had played many times before. "Cathari, Commander," Sithara responded, "I suggest you look more carefully at our fleet." There was a pause as the enemy sensors swept across the Valorian formation. And when the Cathari commander spoke again, there was confusion in its voice. "This is impossible," it said. "Those ships were destroyed, and our scans confirm catastrophic damage to their engine cores." "And yet," Sithara replied. "Here we are, Admiral," Deacon said softly. "If you will allow me to coordinate the battle, I believe I can give us our best chance." Sithara had commanded fleets for 200 years and had never surrendered authority in combat to anyone. But she looked at this human with his oil-stained hands and his calm certainty, and she made a decision that her ancestors would have found unthinkable. "The fleet is yours," she said. Deacon Gray stepped forward and began issuing orders in a voice that carried across the bridge with quiet authority. "All ships, break formation and scatter," he commanded. "I want every vessel moving on independent courses with random pattern changes every 30 seconds. The Valorian tactical officers looked at Sithara in confusion, because this order violated every principle of coordinated fleet combat. But she simply nodded, and they obeyed. The Cathari responded exactly as Deacon had predicted, their hive mind attempting to process the chaotic movement of 43 ships that refused to behave like a proper fleet. And in their moment of hesitation, Deacon struck Attack Group 1. "Target their command ship with everything you have, and do not stop until your weapons are empty." 7 battered Valorian cruisers converged on the Cathari flagship with weapons blazing, their attacks uncoordinated and wild in ways that made them impossible to predict. And while the enemy shields held against the assault, their attention was fixed on the obvious threat. "Attack Group 2, Deacon continued. "Vent your plasma reserves directly into the enemy formation." This order caused genuine horror among the Valorian bridge crew, because venting plasma was an act of desperation that could damage the ships that did it. But Deacon's calm voice brooked no argument. 6 cruisers opened their plasma vents and released superheated gas in expanding clouds that flooded the space around them, blinding Cathari sensors and corroding the delicate targeting systems that gave the swarm its precision. The Cathari scattered to avoid the plasma clouds, and their perfect formation broke apart like a mirror struck by a stone. "Now," Deacon said with grim satisfaction, "Attack Group 3. Engage the isolated elements before they can reform." The battle that followed was unlike anything the Valorians had ever experienced or the Cathari had ever faced. Deacon fought with no regard for doctrine or tradition or the proper way things should be done. And he used every dirty trick that humans had learned in centuries of fighting wars against each other and against the universe itself. When a Valorian destroyer lost its main weapons, Deacon ordered it to ram an enemy cruiser at full speed while its crew evacuated to nearby ships by shuttle. When a frigate's reactor began to overload from damage, Deacon had it ejected into the middle of the Cathari formation, where it detonated Like a star being born, ships that should have been protected were sacrificed to create openings. And ships that should have retreated were ordered to advance into certain destruction if it meant taking enemies with them. The bin. Cathari could not adapt to an enemy that did not behave like an enemy should. And their hive mind struggled to find patterns in chaos that had no pattern. And their perfect discipline meant nothing when they faced opponents who had no discipline at all. "They are breaking," Velthos reported with wonder in his voice. "The swarm is retreating," and it was true. Because the Cathari who had come expecting helpless prey had instead found a fleet of wounded ships that refused to die. Commanded by a human who understood something the perfect species never learned. Sometimes, the only way to win is to be willing to lose everything. As the last of the Cathari fled into fold space, leaving behind dozens of their own destroyed vessels, silence fell over the bridge of the ascending light. Deacon Gray stood motionless at the command station, his face lined with exhaustion and something that might have been grief. "Report," Sithara said quietly. 24 ships lost," Velthos replied. And his voice cracked on the number. 19 remain, though several are barely functional. More than half the fleet was gone. Thousands of Valorian lives spent in the desperate gambit that Deacon had orchestrated. And for a moment, Sithara felt the weight of those losses like a physical blow. The Cathari lost over 60 vessels. Velthos continued. And their command ship was destroyed in the final assault. Deacon finally moved, turning away from the viewport where he had watched ships burn and crews die at his command. "I am sorry," he said. And his voice was rough with emotion he did not try to hide. "I wish I could have saved more." Sithara looked at this human who had given her fleet a chance to fight, who had taught her people to think in ways they had never imagined, and who had led them to victory through sacrifice that he clearly felt in his soul. "You saved all of us," she said. "Every Valorian who survives today owes their life to you." "They owe their lives to themselves," Deacon replied. "I just showed them what they were capable of when they stopped believing in impossible." The 19 surviving ships of the 7th Expeditionary Fleet limped into formation, their hulls scarred and their systems failing, and their crews exhausted beyond measure, but they had won. They had faced destruction and found a human who knew that being broken was not the same as being defeated. And as the fleet began its long journey home, Admiral Sithara stood beside Deacon Gray and wondered what else humanity might teach the galaxy about surviving when survival seemed impossible. The journey back to Valorian space took 3 weeks. And in that time, Deacon Gray became something he had never expected to become. He became a teacher. Every day Valorian engineers came to him with questions, bringing broken components and failed systems and asking how a human would approach the problem. And every day, Deacon showed them solutions that made them shake their heads in disbelief before trying them and finding that they worked. Taught them to look at failure not as an ending, but as information, as a sign that pointed toward solutions they had not yet considered. He taught them that elegance and perfection were luxuries that desperate people could not afford, and that survival often wore ugly clothes and spoke with a rough voice. And he taught them the most human lesson of all, which was that the universe did not care what you thought was possible, and the only limits that truly mattered were the ones you accepted in your own mind. When the battered fleet finally emerged from fold space above the Valorian homeworld, they were met by a flotilla of pristine warships that had been sent to search for survivors. Admiral Sithara stood on her bridge and accepted the congratulations of the High Command with quiet dignity. But when they asked how she had accomplished the impossible, she told them the truth. "A human showed us the way," she said 3 days later, in a conference room aboard the orbital station that served as headquarters for the Valorian Engineering Corps. Deacon Gray sat across from a semicircle of the most respected engineers in Valorian, civilization, they had reviewed the recordings of what he had done to their ships. And their expressions ranged from fascinated to horrified to something that looked almost like hunger for knowledge. "We have studied your methods," the eldest among them said, his voice carrying the weight of 4 centuries of accumulated wisdom. "And we must confess that we do not understand." "What do you not understand?" Deacon asked. "All of it," the elder replied. "You took ships that by every measure we know were destroyed beyond any hope of recovery, and you made them function using techniques that should not work." Deacon leaned back in his chair and considered how to explain something that felt as natural to him as breathing. "Let me tell you about my home," he said. The Valorians listened as Deacon spoke of Earth, a small blue planet circling an ordinary star in an unremarkable part of the galaxy. And he told them of the creatures that had evolved there under conditions that the Valorians would have considered impossibly harsh. "My ancestors lived in caves," he said. "They had no technology and no knowledge and no resources except what they could find with their hands and their wits." He told them about humans who crossed oceans in boats made of wood and cloth, navigating by the stars because they had no other way. He told them about humans who went to their moon in a ship held together by rivets and hope, powered by engines that exploded just enough to push them forward without killing them. He told them about humans who survived ice ages and plagues and famines and wars, who built civilizations and watched them fall and built them again because they refused to accept that anything was truly the end. "You built your civilization on abundance," Deacon said. "You had resources and time and safety, and you grew technology like gardens grow flowers, beautiful and perfect and fragile." He leaned forward with intensity in his gray eyes. "We built our civilization on scarcity," he continued. "We never had enough of anything, not enough food or shelter or time or knowledge. And we learned to make do with what we had because the alternative was death." The eldest engineer nodded slowly as understanding began to dawn in his ancient eyes. "You are saying that our very success has made us weak." "Not weak," Deacon corrected, "just different. And you have lost something that you never knew you needed until you needed it." He stood and walked to the window that looked out over the Valorian homeworld, a planet of crystalline spires and perfect cities that had known 10,000 years of unbroken peace and progress. "My people have a saying," he said, "necessity is the mother of invention. And it means that we create the most amazing things when we have no other choice." He turned back to face the engineers. "You have had choices for so long that you forgot what it felt like to have none. And when your fleet was broken, you could not fix it because your minds could not conceive of fixing something without the proper tools and time and materials. But you could," one of the younger engineers said. "I could." Deacon agreed, "Because where I come from, we never have the proper tools or time or materials. And we fix things anyway, because that is who we are." Admiral Sithara had entered the room while Deacon spoke, and she stepped forward now with something in her hands that gleamed with official significance. "Deacon Gray," she said, "the Valorian Concordat wishes to extend an offer to you." She presented him with a crystalline badge that pulsed with soft light, and he took it with confusion on his weathered face. "We would like you to stay," Sithara explained. "We want you to teach our engineers what you taught the survivors of the 7th Fleet. You want me to teach them to use tape and wire to fix crystalline matrix engines. We want you to teach them to think like humans," Sithara replied. "We want you to show them that impossible is just a word, and that broken does not mean defeated." Deacon looked at the badge in his hand, and for a long moment he was silent. "I am just an engineer," he finally said. "I fix things because that is what I do, not because I have any special wisdom." "That is exactly why we want you," the eldest Valorian engineer said. "You do not think of what you do as special because to you it is simply normal. And that is the lesson we need to learn." 6 months later, The Valorian Engineering Academy opened a new department with a human name that had been translated into Valorian script. It was called Expedient Solutions, the Human Method, and its first instructor was a 52-year-old man with oil-stained hands and a roll of tape in his pocket on the first day of classes. Deacon Gray stood before a room full of Valorian students who had been raised to believe in perfection and permanence and the proper way of doing things. "Welcome," he said. "My name is Deacon Gray, and I am here to teach you the most important lesson the humans have ever learned." He held up a strip of gray tape and a piece of wire. "Perfection is the enemy of survival," he said. "And today, we are going to learn how to survive." The students exchanged uncertain glances, but they listened and they learned. And in the years that followed, the galaxy began to hear stories of Valorian engineers who could fix anything with anything, who refused to accept that problems had no solutions, who had learned to think like the strange creatures from upper seas, small blue planet, who had never known the luxury of giving up. And it all started because a human with a bag of tools looked at the impossible and asked a simple question. "Can I take a look?"